Margaret, alas Concordia. Minister, it's important for us to say that nobody should be in any doubt that the reason we are here debating this legislation is because of the catastrophic failure of the Irish financial system due to reckless property speculation and the appalling mismanagement of some of our financial institutions. It is the business of us here in Dáil Éireann as legislators to create the law. It's the business of the executive to govern, and it is the business of the judiciary to interpret the law. It is not our job as TDs to interpret the law or to administer justice, and it's extremely important that we preserve the independence of the judiciary. To that end, it is not normal that we discuss an individual judgment or trial as part of the normal business of this House. But the fact is that it is impossible to properly explain this bill without referencing that its primary purpose is to address criticisms by a member of the judiciary of some of the failures of the Office of Corporate Enforcement following one of the most high-profile failed corporate prosecutions on record. A prosecution undertaken following the collapse of a financial institution which had been recklessly and foolhardily guaranteed by the state. There is a perception among the ordinary person that collectively the legislature, the executive and the judiciary have failed in our duty in so-called white-collar crime is legislated for, investigated, prosecuted and sentenced in a way that is appropriate for the seriousness of the damage that it has caused. To be honest, it is difficult to disagree when you look at the many repeated failures of our system to detect, investigate, prosecute and convict those who abuse our financial, corporate and business laws with complete disregard for their victims. And let's be clear who those victims are. When financial crime results in the collapse of a bank or an insurance company, workers thrown out of their jobs, customers left high and dry, and the state ends up picking up the pieces, we are all the victims. When financial misdeeds force the state to step in and bail out whole industries on the brink of collapse, we are all victims. When people cook the books, cheat taxes, and siphon off profits, we are all victims. During the implosion of the property bubble, ordinary workers saw themselves again and again thrown under the bus by the actions of a few directors and CEOs who saw themselves as above the law. And let's be under no illusion. Corporate crime at the highest level is often difficult to detect, complicated to understand, and expensive to properly investigate. Too often, the perpetrators convince themselves that they are bending, not breaking, the rules, or that financial crimes are mere minor misdemeanours, the kind of trifling technicality that still allows you to sit in the Dáil, despite a clear criminal conviction on financial matters, and have a direct phone line to ministers. We, the people, need a proper agency to tackle this crime and to protect us from the social, financial damage to our people. But we also need a system which will lead to outcomes and consequences, sentences and punishments which show the people of this republic that we are serious about tackling corporate crime. The Office of the Director of Corporate Enforcement was established following the Ansbacher scandal of the 90s and the repeated findings of corruption, bribery and wrongdoing by tribunals which previously led to seemingly minimal consequences for those implicated. While the OCDE had some successes, it has become abundantly clear that it is only scratching the surface of what is required and was unable to deploy and exercise powers and resources to protect our society from the highest levels of business and financial fraud and crime. In 2016, the Office of the Director of Corporate Enforcement returned more than half its budget unspent. Under this government, the OCDE had to wait almost a year for the allocation of 6 detectives it had asked the Garda Commissioner and the government for in order to do its job. It is no exaggeration to say that the collapse of the Celtic Tiger case at the heart of this bill has been held up to almost every TD in this chamber as an example of how the rich and powerful always get away with it. But we should not seek to scapegoat individuals or a single organisation. As legislators, we need to take responsibility to make sure that we can do what we can to tackle corporate fraud and to do so in a way that people are dealt with fairly, but that the ordinary person in the street would have confidence that white-collar criminals who steal, cheat, manipulate people or entities to the tune of millions of euro is subject to consequences appropriate to the scale of their crimes. The main component of this bill is to amend the Companies Act to establish a corporate enforcement agency to replace the OCDE. We support, as a Labour Party, the establishment of this new agency and absolutely support making it a commission independent of the Department of Enterprise. However, we cannot just stop there. My fear is that we just set this up in the misapprehension that our work is done only for the next scandal to result in more shaking of heads, an inevitable review, and another fruitless exercise in shutting the stable door after the horse has bolted. Because the problem of corporate crime is not just a problem that can be solved by setting up a new agency and walking away. What we need is a complete change in cultural, political, and social attitudes. Corporate crime is born of the right-wing attitude that greed is good. Corporate crime is born of the attitude that regulations only apply to ordinary people, that profit for the shareholders are all that matters, and that rules are there to be bent. Corporate crime is born of the attitude that company law is there to be exploited rather than obeyed, and that paying tax is an imposition to be avoided rather than a valuable contribution to running a better society. And I would remind people in this House that tax exiles are not heroes. We need a society where business ethics are taken seriously and not just paid lip service to. I would urge you to remember that the Corporate Enforcement Agency can only be as effective as the laws we give it to enforce. Unfortunately, the constant refrain of too much red tape or too many regulations, led by some in the private sector and backed by industry lobbyists and some of our politicians, is all too persuasive in Irish life and undermines the robust framework of legislation needed to prosecute and punish so-called white-collar crime. Too often we see campaigns to have regulations watered down or undermined or abolished. Unfortunately, there is particularly on the right a culture of paying lip service to corporate social responsibility while trying to undermine the proper regulation necessary to protect workers, consumers, and honest business people. We see the failure of adequate legislation to deal with the failures of mica and pyrite and fire safety in construction, and many of the business entities responsible for such scandals disappearing and re-emerging, the principles hiding behind the shelter of corporate laws. So as we debate this bill, we must look at the provisions and ask ourselves, are we doing enough? And is there any way we can strengthen the agency and its powers to make sure it has what it needs? As the bill proceeds through a committee stage and beyond, we must examine every clause and ask ourselves, will this help deliver justice? I know, for example, section 944AF provides that corporate enforcement authority may not impose on a director a monetary sanction that would make them bankrupt. It provides that only one monetary sanction may be imposed where more than 2 breaches of the same conduct have occurred, and it reenacts section 597G of the Companies Act 2014. We might reasonably ask whether, in the eyes of the ordinary person, such provisions are consistent with how ordinary people are treated. If someone breaks any one of our county bylaws on parking, road tolls, etc., they must pay a fine for each instance. They don't get to say, oh, well, please, I only want to pay one fine for every time I break a parking rule. I would also be concerned that the threat of bankruptcy is not abused as a mechanism for refusing financial penalties for serious breaches of corporate law, particularly in view of the reform to the bankruptcy laws and procedures. As well as the main section establishing the Corporate Enforcement Authority, the bill also provides for the implementation of several recommendations of the Company Law Review Group relating corporate governance, shares and share capital, which again we will hopefully be able to welcome as strengthening the protections for citizens. In conclusion, this bill brings back memories of what some of the most painful and appalling travesties of Irish political and financial history. It is ironic that we're here to discuss a bill introduced by a Fine Gael Minister for Enterprise, Trade and Employment under a Fianna Fáil Taoiseach. But I would remind the Minister that what we speak of here is fundamental to the future of our republic. I taught for a time in the North Inner City in Dublin, and there used to be media reports of the community in which I served, and it was just beside the IFSC. And what media reports used to say in the 90s is that it should be the aspiration of young people in the North Inner City to get employment in the IFSC. And they used to pretend that the crime was all in the North Inner City. And the paragons of virtue were those who were wearing suits in the IFSC. And if only those young people could turn away from the parallel economy, turn away from the temptation of cheap money and criminal activity, and turn their eyes to the IFSC, then maybe they'd have a better future. And all the while, the criminality that almost brought down this republic was taking place in the IFSC. And that's the crux of the matter when you're talking to a young person and the choices that they have. Are we equal, or are there different laws for people who wear different suits?